Hi everybody, welcome to this episode of Enlightenment Today. I'm Jason. Today we'll speak about one of the oldest philosophies and practices known to the human race, which comes from India, known as Advaita Vedanta. A lot of you are probably asking, what is Advaita Vedanta? Well, Advaita Vedanta is the oldest extant school of Vedanta. Now you're probably asking, what is Vedanta? So Vedanta is a divergent philosophical view that developed on the basis of a common textual connection. Now that common textual connection is known in Sanskrit as prasthana trahi. Now this is a Sanskrit word which refers to the three sources of Vedanta that make up Vedanta philosophy. Now the three sources are the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. These three texts that make up Vedanta philosophy. A lot of you are probably familiar with the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita especially. Now, as a result of these three texts, there are more than 10 schools of thought in Vedanta. But there are really only three major ones that we need to consider. The first is Advaita. Now, Advaita means non-dualism. The second is Vishishtadvaita, which is qualified non-dualism. And the third is Vaita, which is dualism. Now, the founders of these three schools are some of the greatest philosophers coming from India. The first is Adi Shankara, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, Ramanuja, and then Nimbarka, and last but not least, Madhva. Now, a lot of people refer Advaita Vedanta, when they think about Advaita Vedanta, they think about Adi Shankara. Now, Shankara lived in the 8th century, and he was the principal exponent of Advaita Vedanta interpretations through his numerous commentaries on the three texts that we just mentioned. Though he was not the first, but he systemized the works of all the preceding philosophers before him, and he was probably the main reason why it is such an old philosophy that's still with us today. Shankara contributed a lot to Indian thought and spirituality in general, and heavily influenced all Hindu beliefs, I believe. Now, when we look at the word Advaita, Advaita in Sanskrit literally means not to, no second, okay? So what this means, the core of Advaita Vedanta and Shankara's philosophy is why they say not to, no second, which refers to non-dualism, means that in Sanskrit, the Atman, which is the undifferentiated consciousness known as the true self within us, the deep down essence of our own being, is identical with Brahman, which is the ultimate reality of the entire universe. Now, the concept of Brahman, Shankara's concept of Brahman, is actually similar to Mahayana Buddhism, because when we look at the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, Nagarjuna's idea of sunyata in Mahayana Buddhism is very similar to Brahman, and this sometimes leads people to think that Shankara was a crypto-Buddhist, but we don't know, because Nagarjuna was before his time. But that's only speculation. But anyway, the concept there of Brahman, Shankara's Brahman, is similar to Nagarjuna's sunyata. So, how do we get into this? How do we develop this relationship between the Atman as identical with the Brahman? So Advaita Vedanta emphasizes the path of Jana Yoga. So Jana in Sanskrit, which is similar to, almost the same as the Greek gnosis, is the knowledge and experience of Brahman, which gives release from bondage. Okay. So release from bondage in this sense is the bondage of all of the contents and activity within your own mind that continually make you suffer and see reality incorrectly, where you start to think that reality is not non-dual. This is from the Advaita Vedanta perspective, because they believe that everything is Brahman, everything is non-dual. The contents and the activity in our mind, if we identify with it, keeps us from our own Atman, and we see reality incorrectly. So they emphasize the path of Jana Yoga. Now, Jana Yoga is the progression of study and the training of our awareness and our mind to attain moksha. Now, moksha in Sanskrit means liberation. Liberation from the duality within our mind. Liberation from that which makes us suffer, that which makes us see reality incorrectly, and frees us in this life. So the Advaita Vedanta view is that we don't have to wait to death to be free. We can be completely free within this life, right now, if we choose to identify with Atman, which is identical with Brahman. This is the Sanskrit concept of ajivan mukta. Ajivan mukta in Sanskrit means someone who is completely liberated in this life while they are still in the body. Okay? So this is why the ancients say, making the vision absorbed in jnana, one sees the world as Brahman. Okay? So again, in Advaita Vedanta, we encounter the problem. How do we get to that stage of seeing the world as Brahman? So Jana Yoga is emphasized as a path for training our awareness and giving us the deep knowledge of Brahman within our own being, as our pure being. But for all of us, when we come into this world, what eclipses this view is the concept of Maya. Now, Maya eclipses this vision, okay? So a lot of people interpret Maya in the sense of the illusion of the physical world. So, you know, people believe this is the illusion. This is an illusion, you know, they think it's all subatomic particles and so forth and so on. This is different from the Advaita Vedanta view, where if we look at the root Sanskrit of Maya is murta, which means measurement. So what that means is, within our mind, when we identify with the contents and the activity of our mind, we begin to measure reality according to our own subjective view and conditioning that we have all undertaken since birth. And this causes the Maya effect. So what we've got to do is disidentify with the contents and the activity within our mind, so we can have that vision that is absorbed in jnana, which can perceive Brahman. So Shankara's view of Maya, he explains in a beautiful phrase where he states, Brahman is real, the universe is unreal, and the universe is Brahman. Now that may seem confusing because it's paradoxical, but the third line explains the first two lines. The universe is Brahman. That's the third line. So that means that the universe is real if perceived as Brahman, and it's illusionary if perceived from the activity and contents of our own mind. So it's always Brahman, but it's unreal when we identify with that perspective in our mind from the stream of consciousness, you could say, within our own mental and our own mental faculties. So we have this problem then of, again, how do we see Brahman? So we have the path of Jana Yoga, which a lot of Advaita Vedanta practitioners and people who love the philosophy do follow. But the sustained experience of non-dual reality often isn't experienced longer than 5 minutes for most people. So there were a lot of methods were produced to experience this non-dual reality, and this goes way back into the Vedic civilization and other cultures around that time, even in the birth of Buddhism with Gautama the Buddha. So a lot of the first fasting the mind philosophies were born. So the first philosophies to fast our mind, to empty out the mind and eliminate the contents of our mind to perceive this non-dual experience, more than just for a brief moment, but for extended periods of time. So when we look back into the Vedic civilization, and we find this in the Upanishads, you find the concept of neti in Sanskrit. So neti means not this, or not this nor that. You get my drift. Now, what this means with neti, a lot of people assume, especially in the modern Advaita Vedanta circles and people who follow certain gurus around the world, not this, not the body, they say, not the body. So they start to ignore the body, And as you know, and as I know, and as everybody knows, as soon as you start to ignore the body and just pretend you're not that, you develop a lot of psychosis in your own mind, and your body becomes unhealthy. And the body and mind are, in a sense, related. So you are affecting your cognitive abilities. So the more mature way to see neti neti, and the way it was explained in Advaita Vedanta, is not this, meaning not the activity and the contents of your mind that keep bubbling up to distract you from remaining as the self, as the Atman. That's what neti neti is. So methods to strengthen that ability within our consciousness to perceive the contents and activity in our mind were further developed. And then we have the idea of Vika in Sanskrit, which is translated as discrimination or discernment, the ability to look in our mind or be aware in our own consciousness of the activity bubbling within our mind that often distracts us. If something's passing, oh, look at that. We're like this in our mind all the time. We're distracted by images and thoughts and concepts, and we lose sight of the Atman, of the self, of our pure nature. And so Vika was developed, the ability to discern in your own mind. Now, they went even further into another Sanskrit word, which is vairagya. Now, vairagya can be translated as non-reaction. Now, what this means is when you develop the ability of Vika, of discernment, and being able to discriminate in your own mind, you don't react to impure thoughts or actions that are not needed, that your mind may think that it needs to do, and you begin not to react to everything that your mind bubbles up within you. And you also train this in some sense in the physical world. If there's a situation where there is no need for your input, you remain quiet and you stay in your humble place without engaging all the time in the world. And this has an ability to fast the mind, to cleanse the mind, and to repair the cognition, your own cognition. This is one of the points of fasting the mind, to repair your own cognition. And in the modern day, when we have a look at neti neti, viveka, vairagya from the ancient times, has become more of the modern practice of self-inquiry, which becomes famous from the 20th century sage Ramana Maharishi, where Ramana always focused on the who am I question. This is what self-inquiry is. So you're practicing Viveka in your own mind. You're always seeing, who is it that is identifying with the contents in this activity in your mind. So you remain in the inquiry. And for Ramana's case, almost his whole life he remained in the inquiry. Like, who is this that likes music? Who is this that is angry in this situation? Always being super conscious of what's going on in your own mind and not reacting, having the vairagya training not to react to anything. And this is why Ramana Maharishi, he spent a lot of his life in silence. He spent 7 years at Skanda Ashram on the holy hill of Arunachala and did not say a word. And so to further this practice, this has become sort of a staple in Advaita Vedanta, is the method of self-inquiry, to remain in the who am I question. One of his disciples is Papaji, and Papaji lived in Lucknow in India, and he became famous in the 80s and 90s, and he had a lot of disciples, and one of his disciples was Muji, who is a popular spiritual teacher in the present day. And when Muji was his disciple back in the 90s, he had his own struggles with the practice of Advaita Vedanta, the remaining in the inquiry and so forth and so on. And Muji said to Papaji, he wants to know the truth and so forth and so on. And Papaji said, if you want to know the truth, you must completely disappear. So that kind of hit Muji like a ton of bricks, that to know the truth, he must completely disappear. So what that means is Muji was supposed to eliminate the ego, actually the whole persona system. And this is one of the focuses in Advaita Vedanta, the idea that we can eliminate the person within us to become the Atman. Now, this is where a lot of problems happen in Advaita Vedanta, this perspective, which I'm going to talk about, because a lot of people don't talk about it, especially people who follow the philosophy and practice of Advaita. They actually start to be hypnotized into thinking that they're not the person, that they have no personality and it doesn't really exist, and so forth and so on. But if you kick them up the bum, you know, they go ouch, or, you know, all of these things, there's still somebody there. There's a lot of misconception about the Advaita Vedanta in this sense, and a lot of people take it to the extremes because they think that if they act out of their own personality, then they feel a lot of guilt because they think that it's not real. Oh, I'm under the illusion of Maya, the spell of Maya again, and so forth and so on. Now, to tackle these problems, we need to ask the question, can we really get rid of the personality? Can I really get rid of the Jason within me? Now, a lot of people use Ramana Maharishi as an example here, and they say, yeah, you can do it. Now, let's be realistic here. When we look at Ramana Maharishi's life, he was 16 when he woke up, okay? So he had this experience of waking up at 16. Now, first of all, we need to explain what it is to wake up. Is it as simple as what Gautama the Buddha said, I am awake? Now, what does Gautama mean there? Gautama means that he has finally become conscious of the content and the activity of his own mind, and he has the ability to see it with a bit of distance and not begin to react from it. And in that place, he is beyond suffering and so forth and so on. He has realized and woken up that his whole life he was in the tornado of his own mind. Now, we need to think about this in the same way, in the sense of Ramana Maharishi. Now, Ramana, you need to remember, he lived in southern India, where the focus is a lot of Vedanta views. And so for someone to wake up in southern India and to go off and become an ascetic is adored and admired, but obviously not by the parents, but most people in the population really do admire a sadhu, someone who is an ascetic and who has renounced the world. So at 16, Ramana left home and he went to the holy mountain of Arunachala in Tiruvannamalai in southern India, and basically spent his whole life there. He never moved, I think, not 3 kilometers from the base of Arunachala for his whole life, and he renounced the world. And this is a very specific archetype within India, and what we see now is a lot of Westerners trying to mimic this, but it doesn't match our own archetypal structure. And again, we have to come back to the idea that people think that Ramana was not the person no more from 16. From 16, he was merged with Brahman. This is most people's belief, and he never existed anymore. Personally, I don't believe that. And there's a few reasons why. Now, is it possible? We have to be real. Is it possible to really get rid of the person? Did Ramana get rid of it? Now, look, the mind, when we really get down to it and we realize that the mind is still there, Ramana would have still had the activity and the contents bubbling in his own mind, but he just never identified with it. This is what we need to understand. The contents and the activity that fuel the personality did not disappear like rain clouds on a sunny day. They were still there, but he never identified with it. He was practicing the Vika and Vairagya. He was in the inquiry. He was just a lot stronger than most of us are in the inquiry. And this inquiry, the self-inquiry, is very similar to mindfulness in Buddhism. Actually, almost exactly the same. So the idea is the more you're in that, the more you identify with the Atman. But you're still the person. This is the thing that people need to realize. You're still the person. The mind and persona don't disappear, but instead they lose their power over you as you reside more as the pure awareness, perceiving the mind's content and activity. This is the idea. You've identified more with the pure awareness beneath the mental structure, and you can perceive it as we just perceive the external world. You are looking at it as almost as an object. Does it mean you don't react to it at all times? That's up to you, because sometimes action is needed. We need to be realistic here. So when we're like this, when we start to think that we can't identify with our personality, or we are not the person, this leads a lot of people to not address their own personal and psychological problems. Now, when we don't treat our own personal and psychological problems, which is an aspect, we need to remember, our psychology is an aspect, if we want to get down to it in Advaita Vedanta, is an aspect of Brahman, it's an aspect of the universe. So why should we not treat that? And what happens if we don't treat that? And I can tell you, I've seen a lot of people around the world who exhibit a lot of psychosis, who follow the path of Advaita Vedanta because they have not treated their own psychological state. They have suppressed it. So what happens is when we don't address our own personal and psychological conditioning and trauma that we might have had from the past, this leads to what is known as spiritual bypassing. Now, spiritual bypassing was a term coined by psychologist John Wellwood in 1984. Now, spiritual bypassing is basically when we follow spiritual practices and beliefs, including non-dualism, to avoid painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. So you might ask, we see spiritual bypassing all the time, and we all have exhibited spiritual bypassing. I remember when I cut my teeth on Advaita Vedanta many, many years ago and followed the practice sternly, I exhibited a lot of spiritual bypassing. And so I suppressed a lot of painful feelings and emotions and that needed to be dealt with. So you often see this in satsangs, when gurus hold satsangs, especially gurus from Advaita Vedanta. They exhibit a lot of spiritual bypassing, and they spiritual bypass with the disciples. For example, a disciple may come up with some past trauma to the guru. I've had this experience in the past and I can't let it go. It's still there in my mind. And often you'll hear the guru say, "Who is the one it happened to?" So all of these clever phrases, to try and get them back into the inquiry. But the problem is past trauma cannot be healed by such inquiries. It just can't. You'll continue to be mindful, there's no doubt about it, but it's like sitting on the meditation cushion, but sitting on the meditation cushion is all your emotions and all your past trauma that's sitting there, and all you're doing is sitting on top of that and being quiet and blissful for 30 minutes and then walking away, and you're still agitated and it's still overflowing in your mind because you haven't treated your own past trauma, your own psychological problems, which we all have because we all are human and we all exist. So I think that Advaita Vedanta can have a tendency to spiritual bypass a lot with the philosophy and practice, but in reality it doesn't have to be that way. So the point of Advaita Vedanta is to recognize the ever-present non-dual reality and to reside in that place without ignoring or suppressing our own psychological problems. Okay? Because why would you need to ignore it? If you're practicing awareness training, you're trying to reside in the non-dual reality, why would you not bring in your own psychological problems? Because reality itself is non-dual, so you should appreciate everything and anything. And this is the esoteric idea, the Western esoteric idea of involution and evolution. Involution means when our mind is involved in reality, it's caught in the little details, and we are caught as the subjective person. And evolution is the ability to step back from that and reside in the higher place and perceive all of the mind's contents and so forth and so on, which is similar to Vika and Vairagya, if you remember I mentioned that. So this is very similar. Involution and evolution is similar to the Hindu idea of the breath of Brahma. The breath of Brahma is basically the expansion and contraction of consciousness. So the understanding that the rhythm of the universe expands and contracts. Now, what that means from a perceptual level is that our mind needs to be caught in details to get certain tasks done, but we need to develop the ability to come back and to be able to see reality from a distance and to reside in the non-dual place. Okay, so that's the ability we need to develop. And a lot of people may say, you know, how does this have anything to do with the evolution of the universe? Is the evolution of the universe part of a non-dual reality? Is it actually evolving? You know, what does that mean? So this is the knowledge that the non-dual reality of the universe is identical with the idea of an evolutionary process of the cosmos, which is also evident in your own life, as we all know. So that means that the Godhead, Brahman, is not a noun, but rather a verb, as it is a process with no beginning or end. Okay. So in saying that, the process has no beginning or end. So when we look at the rhythm of the breath of Brahma, can we always be up here in the expanded state without this? And no, that's not the way. That's not the way it is. It's process. It's all process. The idea in Vedanta in India is that, like I said, Brahman is not a noun, it's a verb. There's process with no beginning or end, and that's it. And that's basically your life. The reason we suffer is we think that we begin, we are born, and then we die. And that notion is thrown out in Vedanta because there's only process. There is only the non-dual reality that never started and will never end. And the only way to sink in with it is to be present and to be completely present in this moment right now. So that's the perspective. Okay, so you really need to be careful about fooling yourself into thinking that you are not going to be a person anymore if you follow Advaita Vedanta. And you will find out eventually that is not true anyway, because the contents of your mind, the activity of your mind just continues to move, because the mind is related to the energies of the universe. This is what is known as Prakriti in yogic philosophy. It's related to that. So all of the energy in the universe, your mind is just a part of that. That's it. But the point is, especially in yogic philosophy, is to identify with Purusha, which is the pure awareness. So identify with this, be conscious of this, and engage in Prakriti when it is needed. But do not forget that you are Purusha, that you are the Atman, which is identical with Brahman. Okay. So if you want to know more about Advaita Vedanta and Vedanta in general, then I have a few books to explain to you, several books I should say. The first book obviously is the Upanishads. Now this is a translation and commentary from Eknath Eshwan. I like this. A lot of people think it's a stale version, but I like this. But there are many versions of the Upanishads out there. But if you're going to buy the Upanishads, I would say if you want the three sources of Vedanta, you should also get a good copy of the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras. But definitely this is a source book if you want to understand Advaita Vedanta knowledge. Another great book is the Song of the Avadut, more well known as the Avadutta Gita. These are spiritual utterances, spontaneous spiritual utterances from a sage called Dattatreya. And a lot of people don't know whether if he existed or not, but this book exists, and the Avadutta Gita is very popular, and it's a great book to get your mind into this Advaita Vedanta thinking, okay? This perspective of Advaita Vedanta. Another great book is the Song of Ribu, or the Ribu Gita. This is very popular in Tamil Nadu in India. This is the translation of the Tamil version. And again, this one is really more kind of trying to get your mind in the non-dual reality. There's a lot of verses that are very repetitive, like everything is Brahman and you are that. Everything is Brahman and you are that. It constantly goes like this sometimes for some verses. So this is definitely an acquired taste for a lot of people, but it's an interesting book. Another book I recommend is Be As You Are. These are the teachings of Ramana Maharishi, and this is edited by David Godman, and this is a great book. This is some of Ramana's talks that have been written down and translated into English. I highly recommend this because Ramana gets into a lot of Advaita Vedanta philosophy and what it is to be a Jnani, to be a sage who follows the path of Jana Yoga. Another book I highly recommend is The Book by Alan Watts. Some people may think, why is that in there? But Alan has a beautiful way of explaining Vedanta for the modern mind, and I really recommend this book. It's actually one of my favorite books on Vedanta philosophy, just because he's more of a contemporary philosopher. And yeah, this is a brilliant book. Definitely highly recommended. Another book is by Joseph Campbell. This is Myths of Light. There's so many good books by Joseph Campbell, but this one is great. This is Myths of Light, Eternal Metaphors of the Eternal. Eastern Metaphors of the Eternal, I should say. So this gets into a lot of Advaita Vedanta thinking and Vedanta in general. Beautiful book, beautiful book. And if you're interested in spiritual bypassing, I recommend this book by Robert Augustus Masters. This is a beautiful, beautiful book which explains spiritual bypassing for anyone who is not familiar with the tendency to spiritual bypass our own psychological problems. And Robert himself is very familiar with Advaita Vedanta and other Eastern philosophies. So I highly recommend this book. So in summary, you are still relatively a person within Advaita Vedanta. The person does not magically disappear. By following the philosophy and practice of Advaita Vedanta, you remain more as the Atman, while you perceive the inherent activity and content within your own mind. That's what Advaita Vedanta offers to all of us. So the person is really just the mask of God from the Vedantic point of view. Because absolutely you are that in Advaita Vedanta. And that is the Supreme Brahman. Thank you for watching today.